All right, chapter 12, looking at the life of Bela Bartok. This is page 414 in your textbook. So Bartok lived from 1881, died in 1945. I think the most prevalent influence for him was Eastern European folk song. He was passionate about that subject. He's Hungarian and certainly influenced by the Hungarian nationalist movement. Like a lot of people, they were swept up in a lot of nationalist pride in the 1800s. He learned how to play the piano from his mom. He did teach piano for about 27 years at his alma mater, so his school, which is the Budapest Academy of Music. And along with just being inspired by folk music, he's also interested in it in almost a fanatical way. He actually went around Europe and other parts of the world to record peasant folk songs because he was so inspired by the idea of folk music in general, and he wanted to study this. Okay, so folk music enthusiast. So he's definitely in the 1800s a leading authority in peasant music. If you had a question about folk music or peasant music, music of the people, you would go to Bartok for sure. He recorded folk songs on a cylinder phonograph. This is what one of those looks like. And he would study the music of the Magyars, the Romanians, Slovaks, Turks, and North African Arabs. So he researched a lot of music from different groups of people. He believed that peasant music could help liberate him as a composer from major and minor scales. So we've seen with a lot of composers, even as far back as Wagner, where people are not interested in continuing using the major and minor scales for forever. They want to expand their knowledge of composition outside of those two scales. And so peasant music, folk music, is actually one of the art forms where it doesn't necessarily adhere to major and minor. So this is what Bartok said. He said, they adhere to the old church modes or the ancient Greek modes and certain still older modes, especially pentatonic, and moreover display extremely free and varied rhythmic structures and changes of meter. So he finds them technically fascinating. He wants to pick it apart and understand how these songs work, because they are constructed differently than what we have in Western classical music. So here is a map of Europe and Northern Africa. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. All of these red stars are the areas where Bartok went to study folk music or peasant music. So you can see he's got a lot of Eastern Europe, a little bit of Turkey, and Algeria. So the man went places. Looking at his career, he was internationally recognized as a composer pretty early on in his career. However, oddly enough, he wasn't famous in his own country until his ballet, The Wooden Prince, premiered in 1917. In the 40s, he moved to America. He was publicly anti-Nazi, so he just didn't want to stay in Europe. He was so anti-Nazi that he refused to let Germany and Italy play his music. He just refused to let them have the rights to that. Because of that, he did face a lot of, I guess, strictures in his composing career. Since he had blacklisted certain countries, he as a composer was blacklisted and people didn't perform his music as often. Therefore, his career kind of went into a decline here. He had little money, he was in poor health, and he felt isolated, particularly in a new country. People in America didn't necessarily enjoy his music. Before he moved to America and before he refused to let his music into Germany and Italy, he was pretty much paid exclusively on commission. So that tells you how successful he was, to where the point he could survive and make a very comfortable living off of just writing music. And we haven't seen a composer do that since like Beethoven. So that's pretty cool. While he was in New York, in America, he was hospitalized, and while he was hospitalized, he was actually commissioned to write a concerto for orchestra, and that's one of his best-known works, and we'll look at something from that. Elements of his music. He says, I do not reject any influence, whether its source be Slovak, Romanian, Arab, or some other. provided this source be pure, fresh, and healthy. Another quote, Hungarian influence is the strongest. So he admits to being influenced by different music from around the world. However, he also is very cognizant of the fact that he is a Hungarian nationalist and he likes the sound of his home country. So what can we say about his style? He incorporates a good bit of Hungarian folk tunes. He likes classical forms, and he's also not a stranger to 20th century sounds. So he's eclectic, to say the least. He wrote for different sets of instruments, piano, strings, chamber music, and he wanted to revive traditional forms. So thinking like sonata form, the fugue, the symphony, the rondo, different things like that, stuff that we learned back in Units 3 and 4. Those are still prevalent to him. His music is technically tonal. He does not go into atonality, but because he doesn't follow necessarily major and minor scales, you're still going to get harsh dissonances. He's going to incorporate polychords and tone clusters because he likes modern sounds. But again, even though it sounds strange, it's still tonal. There's still a tonal center. And just like pretty much everyone else in the 20th century, he uses unexpected rhythms and accents to create more interest. So looking at the Concerto for Orchestra, this was written in 1943, and you have information on 417 in a listening guide on 418. Again, he was commissioned to write this while he was in the hospital in New York by Koussevitzky. He was the conductor of Boston Symphony Orchestra, and he paid Bartok $1,000 to write this piece. Bartok finished it in about 6 weeks, which is quick. It's one of his most popular works, and it has a romantic spirit, so looking towards the past, has folk elements, so looking at small groups of people, and it's traditional. It's much more traditional than what we hear in a lot of his other music, but also a lot of music in the 20th century, in the 40s. Okay, so you have that clip in your listening playlist. Sorry, I forgot to mention, you're going to listen to 2 different movements. The first movement is on page 418. The second movement is on page 420. Both of those are in the playlist. All right, next chapter, Dmitri Shostakovich. This is page 421. He lived from 1906, died in 1975. He is one of the Soviet Union's leading composers. So composers in Russia during the Soviet Union era, he is one of them. There are a few others that were prominent around the same time. But Shostakovich's life and career will demonstrate how artists had to deal with a lot of strictures by the government. Living in a totalitarian regime, there were certain rules that you just could not break, and sometimes you would break them without trying. So Shostakovich definitely experienced that. At age 13, he entered the Petrograd Conservatory. Petrograd is what the city used to be called. It is now called St. Petersburg, so that's where that is. While he's at the conservatory, he studied piano and composition, and he played piano for silent movies after his dad died to help support the family. So here we see a composer who is actually impacted by media, movie theaters. A lot of the times these silent films, just so you wouldn't have to sit in silence, they would have someone playing music. He was a pianist for a film, or for a theater. His first symphony was a triumph, and it kind of launched his career. He was famous not only in Russia, but also across Europe and in the United States. This is young Shostakovich, and a lot of people think he looks like Harry Potter. I have to agree. Okay, so what effect did the Communist Party in the Soviet Union have on artists? This is a good question. So starting in 1929, Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, would terrorize fellow Soviets to promote industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. So to me, that sounds like he wanted to boost the economy quite rapidly and basically catch up to what was happening in Europe. artistically, you wouldn't think that that would be affected, the arts would be affected, but it was. Artistic expression was limited by the Communist Party because they followed the doctrine of social realism. And so in this social realism concept, they basically rejected anything that was modern because it was revolutionary and would stir up feelings of dissent. So they would reject modernism and wanted to remain accessible to the common people. So anything that's kind of light and fluffy and easy to understand. Modern music definitely wasn't easy to understand. Overall, artists were to emphasize that which is heroic, bright, and beautiful. So feel-good music. Shostakovich had to deal with these strictures, these rules. There is some debate about whether or not he was devoted to the Soviet Union, communism, that sort of a thing. I've always been of the impression that he was a silent dissident. So he would follow the rules just enough not to get kicked out, but he did not agree with them. That's how I've always interpreted that. However, I am not Shostakovich. I can't tell you exactly what he thought. But he was certainly impacted by this idea of social realism, and we'll see how in just a second. So Shosty, that's his nickname amongst musicians, Shostakovich versus the Soviet Union. So during his career, while he's in the Soviet Union, he had a very tempestuous relationship with the government, or maybe the other way around. They had a tempestuous relationship with Shostakovich. Sometimes he was in favor with the government, sometimes he was blacklisted. So just to give you an idea, in 1934, he premiered an opera. 2 years later, Stalin said that it was horrible and should never be showed again. Thought it was too modern and risque. The very next year, Shostakovich had favor from the government again with his Fifth Symphony. In 1941, his favor is once again reestablished in the Soviet Union, and even his reputation goes outside of the borders, and he's famous in other countries. With his Seventh Symphony, it's called the Leningrad Symphony. That's kind of its nickname. He starts to write about the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany, how Nazi Germany was trying to invade Russia. But in 1948, he was blacklisted for using modernist trends yet again. So you see, he keeps coming back to the idea of modernist trends. He wants to keep pushing the envelope. In 1949, he was once again in favor, and he was sent as a representative to the World Peace Congress in New York. But in 1962, so for a long time he was in good graces with the government, but in 1962 he was kind of smacked on the hand for using a Jewish poem as the beginning of his 13th Symphony. So the Soviet Union, there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on, and so people didn't like that, and Shostakovich had to revise the 13th Symphony, and even then people would not perform it. So a lot of flip-flopping back and forth. So sorry if it's confusing. I can't quite explain the Soviet Union. But there you go. Shostakovich definitely was impacted by the government rules. So what you are going to listen to is Symphony No. 5. This was written in 1937. It's one of his most popular works. It was described, and we think it was described by Shostakovich, although it could have been someone just using his name, but described as a Soviet artist's practical creative response to just criticism. So realizing that there are rules, going with that social realism idea, but introducing, there are some elements of modernism that are kind of hidden in there. I've had to study this for a class before, and you can see that there are some hidden modern trends. Either way, it is appealing because it has a lot of lyricism with the melody, and the second movement is a scherzo, and that's kind of interesting because when we think of a symphony, we usually think of the third movement as maybe a minuet or a scherzo, but here it's the second movement. So you are going to listen to the second movement. You can find the information about this on page 422 and a listening guide on 423. this will be in your playlist. All right, we'll stop there.